Great. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for attending. We see the attendees starting to enter the room right now. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Zach. I work for Trellis Company, and today we are talking about financial aid offers. So 'tis the season to be awarded aid on your path to a post-secondary credential of some kind. And it's, I would say, sometimes often overlooked. A lot of the research community and a lot of the practitioners and policymakers are really focused on FAFSA, and there's verification communication and companies that help with verification completion to various institutions. But what about the financial aid offer? And isn't that maybe one of the most important documents on the pathway to a post-secondary career? Because that's, the money that you need to get to the school that you want to get to eventually get that credential. So it's a really important piece of student communication that's often overlooked. And our colleagues at uAspire have done a fantastic amount of kind of longitudinal research too, to look at how do we craft these offers in a way that's student-centered, that's simple, that's intuitive, that doesn't use really burdensome jargon. If y'all are from the financial aid space, y'all know what I'm talking about, right? We don't need to speak about it. It's kind of like Voldemort. It that shall not be named. But our colleagues at uAspire done a fantastic job of analyzing some of this stuff and making sense of it for us so that we can help make sense for students and our families and our support network. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to kick it over to Allie and Laura from uAspire just a second. For those of you who are in attendance, if you have a question, you don't need to feel like you need to hold it in. So we've enabled the chat feature, if that's your jam, or if the Q&A feature is your jam. We're going to be open to any and all concerns, any and all questions. If you have a question, don't hold it back. Use the Q&A, use the chat. Both Allie and myself will be looking at those and making sure that your questions are answered. And if it's something that is kind of a larger scale question that we might want to open up a discussion for, we might just hold it till the end, and we'll have a little bit of time at the end. Also, lastly, this session will be recorded. So if you're going to check out early, or if you have a colleague who was excited about this, I know several members of our team were really excited about this and wanted to watch. It is going to be recorded. I will make sure to share that link when the video gets cleaned up. So no worries, we will record the session and I will share that out in due time. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to Laura and Allie at uAspire. Take it away.
Thanks so much, Zach. We're really excited to be here with all of you today. I'll let my colleague Allie introduce herself before she's going to pause her camera and be watching your questions in chat, and then we'll get started.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining today. Allie Cacavella, uAspire's VP of Policy and Systems Change, and I work directly with students and help advance simplicity, transparency, and equity for financial aid and college affordability. So glad to be here today and welcome your questions.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Allie. And my name is Laura Kane. I'm the Chief Policy Officer here at uAspire, and really just thrilled to be here to really talk shop with you around how to communicate financial aid with students. So first off, we wanted to introduce you very quickly to who uAspire is, in case you haven't heard of us before. We're a national nonprofit hyper-focused on college affordability and advancing higher ed equity. And we really see affordability as a lever to do that equity work. We have 3 impact models. We work directly with about 12,000 students a year, both in high school and in the post-secondary space, to help them navigate the complexities of financial aid. We also train school counselors and college advisors to help them use tools and the right information to best advise their students. And we do that nationally with about 3,000 different practitioners each year. And finally, Allie and I are on the policy and systems change team. And in this regard, we see ourselves somewhat as an action tank. So we're leveraging a lot of our frontline experience and expertise with students and as practitioners to help inform policy and systems where barriers exist, especially for students who are first generation, students from low income backgrounds, and from communities of color. This is just to give a quick image about the impacts that we've had looking at our 2018-19 year in terms of the scope of the geography reach. We do have, if you will, brick and mortar offices for when COVID times are lifted in Massachusetts, in Oakland, as well as in New York. And Allie and I are based in Philadelphia as part of the policy team. So in terms of our time today, we're going to focus on sharing some of our research from the Decoding Cost of College report. We'll be getting really nitty-gritty about specific findings and recommendations, as well as then talking about some of the trends of what's happening in improving financial aid offer communication these days. We also will do a little case study with one of our partners, Colorado State University, so you can see a bit of a before and after communication and how they did that process. And of course, we really love engagement. We're educators as well. So please do use that chat and Q&A, and we'll be sure to engage with those contributions. So first off, it's always great to ground ourselves in the why. Why does it matter to have transparent aid offers? And the first point here is really sharing that in our work with thousands of students every year, it's not their acceptance letters that helps them figure out about where they're going to college. It's actually their financial aid offers. And it's at that moment that students really start to reconcile what's possible for them and their future. So a phrase that we use at uAspire is celebrate, then decide. Celebrate when you get your acceptance letter, but decide only after reviewing all of your financial aid offers to make a financially informed decision. Over the years, we have been serving students for over 30 years. And in that time, we now have amassed a collection of over 65,000 financial aid offers given to us by students. And every spring, it was so difficult to help students find the bottom line and to answer the question, what will this college cost me? And we realize that the part of the reason why that's the case is that there isn't any federal policy that exists that requires standardization. Of course, there is the shopping sheet, but that's not required for all students. And of course, the shopping sheet, I'm sure, will be a juicy conversation at some point, because it's not a perfect tool either. But because there are food labels, or when you buy a car, there's a window sticker, in other consumer elements, there's a standardization of how we communicate, both in terms or format, key information to consumers. But that doesn't exist with higher education. Ultimately, again, uAspire, we're an equity-based organization to try and close the opportunity and completion gaps for college. And we really believe and see daily in our work how affordability is a primary obstacle to completion. And of course, when students are borrowing, the more likely that they are to drop out, the much higher risk of default, as I imagine you know well in the work that you do. Let's take a closer look at how this can play out for students. So in terms of the lack of transparency for costs, again, like why should we focus on improving transparency? It really has a negative impact on students. And if you will, on a very micro level, one student at a time. So in this way, unclear estimates can lead students to choose a more expensive school while thinking it actually might be more affordable. And we'll highlight some examples for that later on this morning. Second, if the estimates are too low, this can really cause some problems in terms of not being able to access enough aid. And this is very difficult for students, especially because it can cause them to work more. Oftentimes our students take second and third jobs, which can affect their ability to succeed academically. Or importantly, we've seen really clear research led by many, especially the Hope Center, around increased basic needs security for students. So increasing hunger insecurity, food insecurity rather, and housing insecurity has really escalated, especially during this COVID time. Lastly, if the estimates are too high, then oftentimes Pell-eligible students or first-generation students might think that college isn't for them, or it could lead to overborrowing and then having a higher issue. Lastly, if the estimates are too high, there can be different challenges with refunds. These are all the reasons why communicating the cost clearly and trying to do so accurately is so critical and is a very true student-centered issue. So in 2018, we published the report, Decoding the Cost of College, alongside our partner, New America, who's a think tank in DC. The goal of this was to really leverage this frontline expertise and the data set that we uniquely had from our work with students. We did a quantitative analysis of just over 11,000 award letters. These aid offers came from 47 states, so almost across the country. They represented about 900 and change institutions. and it was collected from just shy of 6,000 students. And in terms of the qualitative review, we did a big deep dive, really looking at the communication, the formatting, the language on 515 of those offers. What we did was take the 900 institutions, we culled out any aid offers that did not include a Pell Grant, and then we also took out any schools that were using the shopping sheet, and we focused on the remaining 515 for this deep dive. Before we get into those qualitative communication aspects of our findings, it's very important to us that we always note what our quantitative analysis looked at. And this was really comparing the different amounts and the packages of aid that our students had. Our student population was just shy of 80% Pell eligible students. And what was very important to us before we get into the formatting is to note that on average, students were facing over a $12,000 gap after taking out loans. So what this graph shows you is that for all the letters, you can see that the gift aid covered about half of the cost, loans about 16%, and the remaining gap was 34%. And then we said, okay, well, then students can live off campus, or students can focus on public institutions, or maybe they should choose less selective. And we heard all of the suggestions that many folks give students sometimes about how to choose an affordable college. And yet the persistence of the gap really remained true, regardless of the student choices. And if you take, for example, all the way on the right-hand side, the 80% grad rate for Pell, so these are more selective institutions, the graph of what the students needed to cover was much smaller at 15%, but the average cost of those institutions is much larger. So the dollar figure actually was more significant, so the percent was smaller. At this point, I want to shift us to really looking at some of the qualitative findings that we found. And what we did find is an absolute hodgepodge of practices of communication. And this makes sense because there isn't standardization of how to do this, and it's very complex information that is trying to be communicated. We have really become very close friends with many financial aid administrators and learned so much in different partnerships with financial aid offices around the country over the past several years. So we understand the challenge of how difficult it is to communicate this. Oftentimes, there's structures with portals and Banner and Ellucian and all the rest that make communicating the infrastructure of communicating very difficult as well. So we're sharing these findings not as a gotcha, but really as the trends that we found to help motivate where and how to make improvements to make things clearer for students. Of course, we know everyone wants students to be making this big financial decision with their families, not in the dark, but with all the critical information they need. So our first finding was around confusing jargon and terminology. And of course, this is something that our host here with Zach Taylor knows quite a lot about, and that we've learned with him as well. But throughout this, we found tons of lingo and acronyms on so many of the aid offers. And of course, we do this in our own practice all the time as well. Financial aid is littered with a lot of very complex terms and different pieces that are used in our practice, but yet the aid offer is a communication tool. So while we don't need to water it down and not help build the students' financial capabilities and literacy, it is important to be aware of how jargon can become complicated and not support the students developing that understanding. We also found an outrageous number of different words, oftentimes for the exact same thing. In one example, 455 of the letters we looked at had the federal direct unsubsidized loan on it. And we found 136 different names for the federal direct unsubsidized loan, 24 of which did not include the word loan. Of course, sometimes that is because of a character limit with technology, but still we would urge to always make sure that any loan fully states that it is indeed a loan. This next slide just shares some of our conversations with students. We did 6 different focus groups with students to support this report and make sure we were hearing from them about what makes sense and what doesn't. And these are a handful of the terms that we found and kind of deemed unfriendly. And this is really a place where we imagine you might have some great contributions. So I invite you to share in the chat that if you had one term that you would eradicate from financial aid, one term that you'd rather not ever use again with students or hear someone else use with students, what would that term be? And a few of those terms might be here, but I imagine that there could be several out there. We'd love to hear your thoughts. So first off on here, board. Room and board, it feels a little bit, to continue the Harry Potter Voldemort comment, feels a little bit like a boarding school. Of course, we have to explain many times to students what that means. So we really think housing and food or housing and meal plan is much more straightforward. The phrase out of pocket is vague, and students do not often know what that means, and they think literally it might mean that they need to pay with cash versus with other vehicles to be able to pay, such as loans, etc. Self-help is also very confusing to students, and they don't understand what that refers to. So we really recommend using work, employment, loans, etc. about what self-help is referring to. Sticker price is another example of lingo, and in fact, it's referring to the cost of attendance, which is a term we teach our students about all the time, and we recommend using that instead of sticker price. And lastly, and we know this is a biggie, unmet need. And of course, we have the expected family contribution, soon to be the student aid index, or soon enough, I guess, in a couple of years. But unmet need is very confusing because students know what they actually need, but that's not necessarily what the calculations show. So we do recommend being more specific about what exactly the calculation is and the terminology to match it. Our second finding was that there was oftentimes a complete omission of the costs. And some of the times there is an omission of the complete cost of college. What we would say is that cost of attendance, addressing both the direct costs to the institution as well as indirect expenses that are needed for the students to succeed. So in general, what we found were about a third and a third and a third. So what I mean by that is that a third of the letters that we reviewed in that group of 500 literally never mentioned cost anywhere on the aid offer. It solely mentioned the aid, the financial aid that was being offered the student. So that's like getting a coupon, but not knowing what the price is of the item that you're trying to purchase. Secondly, another third did provide some information on costs as lump sums. So it would be the direct cost to the college, or it could be COA, but no explanations or communication about what that term means or what's included or what's not included. And then another third did include both the direct costs and indirect expenses, with about 15% that did provide an itemized list, which is the best practice that we heard resoundingly from students, which is what they want and need to make to understand what's included and make good decisions. Here's an example of a letter that only listed direct costs. I'll give you a moment to take a look. This letter does a nice job of showing about the assumptions of being full-time for the two different enrollments. It does itemize tuition and fees and room and board. But what happens here is when you look from the total amount and you go over to the other side with the financial plan summary, where it says the total estimated budget, this is where we've had students be very confused because they would think a total budget would include things like books and different indirect expenses, when in effect, it does not. And so the clarification of a budget, meaning all costs, versus a letter providing only direct costs in this example. The next finding we found was around the failure to differentiate different types of aid. So 7 out of 10 letters really just lumped all the aid together. There was no distinction of what might be grant aid, scholarship aid, loans, etc. And only 10% really separated the aid categories out in that way. Let's look at an example. If you take a moment and look at this aid offer, and you might think to yourself, how is it organized along the left-hand side? And usually we're in a room together talking, but in fact, what we see here is that it's organized alphabetically, which can be a terrific tool to use to present information in a clear way. However, it's not a terrific tool to use to present aid offers. A different example here shows that there's categories for each of the types of aid, and there's a simple explanation that is teaching the students about what that aid type is. And we really commend this approach. This is a best practice that we found in about 10% of the letters that we reviewed. Students very strongly shared with us about how valuable it was to have the differentiation of aid as well as small explanations. Moving along, our fourth finding is really related to PLUS loans. And of course, PLUS loans are different than the federal student loans. They are loans for the parents. They are not yet approved. They require further application. And we have students that this is an important distinction because of relationships that they have with their families. And it's not necessarily an assumption that their families or parents are in a position to take on a loan, nor if they're able to. So in our work, we found that 15% included PLUS loans within the aid offer as if it's an award, as if it's already part of what the student can use to pay for their education, when in effect, that's just not the case and it's misleading. And this almost always leads to big confusion for students about what aid they still need or don't, as well as problems in the summer that contribute to summer melt. 12% of the letters that we reviewed did provide clear communication and help to teach students and families about what the difference is with a PLUS loan versus a student loan. Even very small, simple phrases and language can make a very big difference. So here's an example of a misleading PLUS loan. As you can see for this college, they listed the federal direct PLUS loan and commend them that they mentioned the word offered, though that might be a nuance that's hard for students to understand. It's not necessarily available, that they still need to apply. And in this case, you can see that it's in the amount of $19,575. When you carry it through to the bottom of the aid offer to the total unmet need, again, that phrase that students really have struggled with significantly, that doesn't lead to clarity and transparency. The math shows that, in fact, there's no unmet need. So the way that this goes down when you're advising students, in our experience, is that the students say, I've got it. I've got a full ride. I'm going to Southwestern Research University. Everything's covered. You should see it. I have no need. It's zero. So the assumption then that students make from a presentation in this way is that all the need is covered, when of course there are really critical next steps that need to be made, and it's not necessarily clear that they need to go borrow that money, and it's not them, it is their family, in fact. And there's really important next steps that aren't necessarily guaranteed for them to have that resource yet. Fifth finding that we have is also around a unique piece about how to contribute to their education related to work study. And we have found that this is just so different from grants and loans that while it's considered self-help in terms of the loan, it really should be distinguished in the aid offer. And this is very important because the timing of when the students can use those resources is really essential. So we have found summer after summer that students think that work study, often, number one, they think it's a grant. They don't realize that it's a job or employment. So we think those words are very important to use. And then two, they don't recognize about how it's going to be distributed like a paycheck once they get on campus, once they secure a job, once they start the job, and then being able to access those dollars. So very often this is part of the work we do with students in the summer to help close that $2,000 gap or something to that effect. Allie, I'm seeing a hand raised. Is this a moment to pause?
Sure, absolutely. Oh, it looks like the attendee said that was a mistake. So no current.
Okay. All right, no problem. Everybody can raise hands or stretch a little if they need to. Okay, feel free to let me know if it's a good time to pause and have some questions that are tied to the content at hand. So in our research, we found that 60% of the letters did include federal work study just as a line item within all the other aid types without being able to distinguish what work study really is and how that can affect. And here is another example of what that would look like. So in this case, this is an example of a student that would need support to try to figure out how to navigate those missing dollars. And when looking at these large figures, it might seem that $750 or $1,500 or $2,000 seems like a nominal amount, But yet we have found, both in terms of this work, as well as in looking at post-secondary students and our advising there, it's often small dollar amounts that can hold students up from being able to complete or persist effectively in their work. We've seen this a lot with emergency aid, as I'm sure you've seen it too in some of your work, especially during the COVID environment and the challenges that students are facing. So ultimately, one of the biggest things that we see is around what is the bottom line? How much do I need to pay as a student or a student and family for this college for 1 year? And we found that 6 out of 10 letters are not doing the math to show students what they need to pay. And we understand sometimes why, because it's confusing to say what math should be done for the student. And there's so many different factors. This is complex. But yet, if the college doesn't help show the student what that bottom line is, there's going to be continued questions going on and on. And so what we did look at is that we found of the 40% that did do the calculations, we counted over 23 different calculations for that aid. And here is another example of, in essence, getting to the net cost. That's often considered like, oh, every college should calculate the net cost. But again, we found 23 different versions of how those calculations occurred. And this is another good example of how that net cost, and this says net cost after all aid, which by definition of the federal government is not net cost. And it has this one line behind the circle that's talking about credit-based aid offered for a whopping $36,000 and change. And this is something, again, the students see zero net cost. I can go to this college for free. And of course, that's not the case in reality. So we wanted to help show how the calculations that we found in our work, and we see this from working one student at a time when we're trying to help them say, how much is it going to cost me? And we found that these things are very inconsistent. So for this sample aid package, if you will, of looking at just one student, this is a fictitious example, but you can see with a COA of $50K, some of the direct costs at $30,000, gift aid, which could include grants or scholarships at $10,000, of course, federal student loans, a work study of $2K, and a plus loan of $1,500. This is what we then can show you of the student experience. So one student, and then if you will, we saw 23 different calculations, but here are 5 of the calculations we found. And so the students that have those calculations could see this college cost me $14,000 and $14,500 a year, or they could think the college cost them $40,000 a year, when in effect, it's exactly the same cost and aid being offered. It's just that the math is inconsistent. And of course, students are looking and often making the decision to attend the college that is most affordable for them to be able to attend. And that is why more consistent calculations are so critical to have that accuracy for comparisons. Our last qualitative finding that we wanted to offer is very straightforward. And we found that only about half of the aid offers that communicated to students offered really precise next steps. What should the student do next? And we found that this is so critical because that is what students are asking. So it's a fantastic moment to help tee up students for exactly what they need to do. And there's a lot of inconsistency about whether aid was already being accepted on behalf of the student, whether or not the students needed to go into a portal or to accept different aid, and differences about whether they needed to accept loans versus scholarships. And of course, I know there's been a lot of new information right now from FSA with the annual student loan acknowledgement and how that's going to fold in eventually to the summer with MPN and the rest and loan counseling. So those are a summary of some of the findings that we found and where things are very confusing for students in the field, as well as within individual communication tools and how things could be remedied. And now I wanted to take some time to share an example with you about how to think about changes for yourself at your school. So right now, this piece is offering, in essence, a checklist. It's going to really resonate with a lot of what we've already shared from our research. And we have a checklist that we'll be sharing through Zach and Trellis with all of you here today after the presentation. So first off, absolutely break down that cost of attendance. Itemized lists are so critical, and separating for the direct costs owed to the institution and the beyond the bill costs, the indirect expenses, are very critical too, with subtotals of each. And it is terrific practice to make sure that you name the residency, the full-time, part-time enrollment, and housing assumptions on or off campus, and having that listed to show how you are defining that, how you're coming up with that cost of attendance. Secondly, it's terrific to list grants and scholarships separately under their own heading, ideally with a small phrase, does not need to be repaid, and with a subtotal. Next, list your loans separately under its own heading, borrowed funding paid back with interest as a phrase, and then have a subtotal. Fourth, do the math for the students. Talk as a team and figure out how you want to calculate the important cost information for students. We feel strongly that net costs can be valuable to list the COA minus grants and scholarships. We also truly believe in what we call the estimated bill. And this is really what students are also trying to understand and distinguish from what the net costs are. What do they need to come up with to pay in order to begin to be a student at your institution? And this estimated bill is the direct cost minus the grants and scholarships. And I'll show you in a moment, you can also do a version minus the loans that could be applied. Lastly, we feel it's very strongly important to not include work study or Parent Plus loans in any of your calculations, because that money is not necessarily yet available to students. But it can be on the aid offer, but it should not be part of the calculation. It should be part of how students can tap resources to help pay what they need to pay. And that is where the additional options are of those resources. And then lastly, of course, identifying those critical next steps. And this is very important about anything they need to do to accept or to decline, as well as anything to secure their spot with deadlines clearly noted. So with this checklist, I want you to take a moment just with yourselves to jot down 2 or 3 ideas, looking at this list and thinking about how you currently communicate your financial aid packages to students on their aid offers. I invite you to take a moment or two and just jot down a couple ideas about where you think your institution might be able to improve and provide a more student-centered communication. Might be about terminology change, looking at some of the unfriendly terms and changing those to more precise terms. Perhaps it's about a formatting adjustment. Perhaps it's about differentiating those aid types or adding small explanations. Lastly, perhaps it's about adding some clear next steps and really bulleting that with deadlines and clarity for students. Okay, hopefully you've had a moment to think really personally about your institution and your work to come up with a concrete idea. Our goal, again, as practitioners with doing these type of webinars and experiences are not to, as much as it's a Zoom room, not to be talking at you, but really helping you to leave after 1 hour with concrete things that you can do differently. Because we know that you're here today because of how much you care about your students and your teams. We have found that transparent aid offer communications actually enable offices, financial aid offices, to, instead of explain over and over and over again to students the same things, when a more transparent aid offer is used, there's more time for counseling and there's more time for advising students. And that's a really terrific win for your team as well as for those students that you serve. Now I want to go ahead and hop in with an example. And of course, this would have been terrific to be in person. So thank you so much for bearing with us as we share it on the screen. And again, you'll have a copy of these afterwards so you can look closely. One of our first higher ed partners that we worked with to help improve their aid offer in partnership with them was Colorado State University. So I'm going to show a few slides to carry you through their experience to see it in action. So this is where their first letter began. And then we did some talking with them, with their staff. We visited their campus and did focus groups with their students. And we applied this checklist, if you will, to their communications. And these are the changes they made. So again, this is what it looked like first. This is what came out in revision 2.0. First, you can see the clarity of costs. So really looking at that cost of attendance and distinguishing between what's paid to the institution, the direct cost, versus the indirect cost. Second, you can see that they delineated the awards more clearly in terms of grants and scholarships, as well as then to loans. You can also see that they did some of the math, this net cost of attendance, and they showed what that math is. So they explained it to the students. Lastly, really important is they started to take a stab at communicating what to anticipate on the bill. And this was a big decision for Colorado State, and they played with it many times. And they helped teach us about how to present your estimated bill and then including the student loans, what your estimated bill would be. So they chose to use both of those examples. Lastly, over on the right-hand side, you can see where they talked about work study, prepayment plan, or tuition payment plans if your institution has those, as well as a Parent Plus loan. Again, with small language, little explanations. Then they went the following year. This work is often iterative. It takes some time to engage folks and move it through. They came up with a 3.0 version, which is where they're still at today. And this was printed on an 11 by 17 piece of paper that was folded. And so this is like the first page. The second page was the full larger size. And then the third page was folded on the back, if you will. And the first page focused on who Colorado State is and about how it's a great value as an institution. They could communicate a bit of their story and their outcomes as an investment in the student's future and their investment in the students. The inside part really clearly delineated some of the different pieces. First, it was that estimated cost of attendance. And again, it was divided between direct costs and indirect expenses. Second is around the financial aid awards. I can share that students really don't love the word award, especially when awards refer to loans. So we have worked on calling it a financial aid offer as one example. And in this place, you can see in this yellow section how net cost was calculated. And the calculation is shown and it's explained to the students. Then they made the jump because they had some different trends around summer melt and students understanding what their bill would be. And they calculated this estimated bill, again, before and after loans. So students could understand what they would need to pay to the institution. Lastly, on the bottom, they again talk about those other resources available to help support the payment of that education, as well as a glossary right there to help define and teach students key terms. Again, very simple definitions. You see them as phrases and sentences versus very long and complicated, more legalese, formal definitions. Lastly, on page 3 is where they included their next steps and an annual budget worksheet, which is something they had previously, but in a 27-page document that students rarely found. So they were able to couple this together in one communication. Of course, every college is very different, and we recognize that not every school can make the same choices, whether because of staffing, resources, technology, infrastructure, you name it. So this is just one example of how phenomenal experts at Colorado State chose to make communication shifts. And they found after doing so that they had their highest yield of first-generation students and Pell-eligible students ever after incorporating this increased transparency in their financial aid offer. So before we wrap up and shift to questions, I just want to note that there's a lot of change by many folks that's underway. This report came out in 2018, and we have since focused a report on costs beyond the college bill, looking at indirect expenses. So we've been very active working with institutions and trade groups, as well as different policy folks on both the state and the federal levels. Higher ed institutions, we're hoping to do a blog and share out some fantastic examples of so many of our partners in this work this spring. So stay tuned. We'll be sure to share that back with you. But schools like Iowa and Temple, Auburn is a group that Allie just met with this week, Columbia, UMass Boston, Amarillo Community College. So many schools we've worked with have done tremendous work to help improve their transparency of the aid offer moment, and then sometimes other elements of their portal or their website and areas as well. And we do want to really mention some of the membership and trade organizations, much like Trellis. Also, NASPA has done some fantastic work, especially with the vendors who are in part of the infrastructure to help them adapt to providing more flexibility to institutions to communicate aid as they wish. And then on the right side of the screen, it's important to note different policy initiatives. Specifically, there are state efforts. New Jersey last year rolled out and passed a bill to include either the federal, what is now the College Finance Plan, or a New Jersey shopping sheet so that New Jersey schools communicated in a common way. And then also federal initiatives have been underway, particularly in the 116th Congress, where 5 different bills were drafted and introduced about increased standardization of how to communicate college costs. There's a pretty big range in what those bills are, from, in essence, requiring something like the shopping sheet or the finance plan, all the way to having different terms and formats that were standard, including a quick reference box as an example. So very different options that likely will get reintroduced in the 117th Congress as we're now underway. Lastly, the federal student aid also initiated initiated some feedback and direction on April 15th in an electronic announcement about what not to do when communicating financial aid. So a little bit shy of a formal regulation, but some great direction about how to improve communication to students. So at this time, I'm just going to say thank you so much and want to finish off with 3 thoughts before opening up to questions. So one is gratitude. Just really thank you so much for the work you're doing every day with students. As fellow practitioners, we understand how difficult that work is, and oftentimes how there's not enough hours in the day to do all the work that you need to do, as well as how challenging it can be with the responsibility to distribute millions of dollars of aid to thousands of students. And we commend you for thinking about how to keep improving the way you do that work. And we recognize sometimes it's a little bit extra and it's hard to find time, especially in such a challenging year as this, to do that effort. So thank you so much for all you're doing. Secondly, I want you to look back at that moment where you identified 2 to 3 areas on the checklist that your institution could improve what you're doing. And think about 1 or 2 colleagues you can go share that with this week. Try to make a concrete commitment about an idea or 2 that you have and who could be your allies to go make that change at your institution. And see if you can reach out to them or let them know about it by Friday to try to start some momentum on your campus to make some changes. Third, we're here to help. uAspire, as I mentioned, we're an action tank, we're practitioners, we're a nonprofit. We are very happy to talk with any given institution to look at your aid offer or give you some insights about what we're seeing. We also do deeper partnerships with either systems or cohorts of schools, as well as individual schools, to provide more of a deeper consult, which does involve a small cost share, where we share some philanthropy money on our end, and then the institution contributes a bit too. So if you're interested in something deeper or a longer term partnership, we invite you to connect with us as well. So we're very happy to just shoot over email and hop on the phone with any of you for just a pro bono conversation about how to help apply these concepts at your school. And on that note, we'd love to just open it up to questions and thoughts from the group.
Thanks, Laura. There was a couple questions in the chat. One question relates to the order of dollar amounts shown on the aid offer, and inquiry about what students really prefer to see sequentially in terms of aid sources.
Great. I'm going to apologize for 1 minute. Are you seeing the chat when I'm clicking on it on my screen? Because I know I'm sharing.
Nope.
No. Okay, great. I just wanted to make sure I'm not confusing the group. Great. So the order of the dollar amounts. Yes. So in terms of that, students like to know the cost first. So starting with the cost of attendance with those itemized breakdowns is really important first. Second, then you're talking about the aid that you're offering in order to help cover those costs. And we recommend, and we heard from students in our groups very consistently, the grants and scholarships. So the first thing you start with are the most ideal ways to fund that education and those costs above. So starting off with grants and scholarships, then going to student loans is the preferred approach. And then, as I mentioned, keeping work study and Parent Plus loans or payment plans even below and outside of the calculation at the more toward the bottom of the letter.
Another request in the chat was specific to the Colorado State example, Laura. I know we're going to be sharing resources so folks can get a closer look at those examples, but there was interest to see the before and after, and of course, we know it's iterative, and there are, a couple pages to their final version, but thanks for reviewing that if additional questions there.
You bet. Yeah. And I'll be honest, this started, we had met Tom, who is at the time, the director of the financial aid team there, who's now in an additional role of associate provost. We met him at a conference, we were talking with them, and he just asked us over a drink and said, hey, this just isn't working. I have to go to our neighborhood schools and go explain our aid offer. I really think we could use your help if you would sit down and help us with it. And we said, we'd love to do that. And it was a very organic first partnership that we did, which we've now done many times since. So this is where Colorado State started. And they felt good about how to communicate some of the aid. And they felt like this was really meeting the needs from a financial aid perspective of what needed to be on the aid offer. The first shift went to this place of how to really clearly have that cost of attendance, then the awards. And I just need to pull up my other slide because my camera's blocking it. But then really showing the math, that idea of the net cost and showing what that math is. And they also did the estimated bill. And so that was a really interesting conversation for like a month about, should we have two calculations on the aid offer? Isn't that more confusing for students? How can we do it in a way that's clear so that they can understand what it is? And we talked with their students when we visited their campus and walked through. We had two different examples and had them give us feedback on different examples in those focus groups with them. That helped them then make their decision about how to move to the third version. And this, again, the first page of a folded document is the value. The middle page is kind of where the meat and potatoes are, if you will. There has been other research by New America recently, as an example, that kind of recommends not using color. The team was so excited about these colors, and yet the students did give feedback that the colors were a little bit much. So I'll throw that out to you in case you are a design-oriented person. But again, starting with the cost of attendance to the previous question, focusing on the aid offered, and then doing the math, both as the aid offer to the net cost and then the estimated bill. The estimated bill is using the direct cost as the beginning of the calculation, where the aid offered, the net cost, is using the COA. So that's the distinction of the two different calculations, is the starting dollar figure. Then at the bottom are other resources as well as explanation. And then finally, it goes to the last page that includes the next steps and the budget sheet.
Great, thanks, Laura. Another question has come in just about if we know of any institutions who are working to translate their aid offer in additional languages. Of course, we know student body have diverse populations and language, so anything you can speak to on work being done to translate beyond English?
Yes, so we have had a lot of conversations with folks on this, and it is very local, right? So it really depends upon the student populations that you serve. And there are a handful of schools that have done translations into Spanish, and there are some talking about having a cover page that would kind of narrate and orient that might be simpler to do in different languages than the aid offer itself. Again, the intersection with the technology of when and how to deliver this really does become a bit of a logistics issue to problem solve.
Indeed, some of our audience is commenting and questions, curious about any software available to make a model example like we saw with Colorado State, and I believe that was their own internal team, Laura, but maybe you can speak to that a little more.
Sure, yes. So in terms of the Colorado example, Actually, Brianna, the pretend student, is someone who came in and works in communication that he brought on his team, which is a unique resource to have. Right now, for example, we're working with the University California Office of the President. So we're working with all 9 of the UC colleges with undergraduates, and they have a range of resources and different folks for designing what they do. So the range really depends upon the campus itself and what limits you have from the structure, as well as what opportunities. So in terms of outside designers, oftentimes working with other departments on campus who might do design, et cetera, can come and help be an asset to your team to give advice and tips, because of course, communication is another whole skill set, as we've learned a lot about. Secondly, there are different vendors like a Campus Logic. Of course, these are for-profit companies, so I'm not advocating for one versus another, but I can say that we've talked with them many times and have trained some of their staff around how to design communications in ways that are really applying this checklist and these principles. They deliver it through a layering on of technology that in essence crosswalks with whatever your existing student information system is. So it doesn't mean that you need to be changing any of your infrastructure. That's very campus wide, and of course, usually pretty big decisions that are beyond just the financial aid office. So then they offer some services that layer on, and then in essence deliver what are basically personal HTMLs to students to be able to access their aid offers in that way. And finally, others have done it that, especially for returning students, everything is existing within portals. And so they have gone ahead and just worked with someone with design, either from their institution or someone who helped them. And they just designed the PDF that they put as an attachment within the portal. Because again, how to control the portal structure and system sometimes is more complex and more rigid than you all might desire of how you'd want to change the look there.
Some of our attendees are also asking about the issue of delivery of the aid offer and what are the different modalities that we've seen in supporting transparency regardless of method.
Absolutely. So in our student focus groups, very consistently, the feedback is, the acceptance letters in this, gold envelope and all big and exciting. And my financial aid offer sometimes is like just a regular business envelope, easier to miss. And they said, we think it should be reversed. So going back to that celebrate, then decide, there has been really consistent feedback for students that they want it both ways. They think that having that hard copy is valuable to them. Of course, we recognize that that costs money and all of this has different resource constraints, but they really do believe that getting it in their email, being able to learn the portal, but also getting, especially for new students, getting that packet or the information concrete in their hands is really key. There has been some very good success with the electronic delivery when it does include especially kind of more custom videos or different links and things. That's also very positive as well. But even then, it can be something in print that at least gives the PDF, and you can say, go here to see it live, where the links will carry you to get further information in different spots.
Similarly, an attendee is noting that often there are different systems and different terms and formats between departments, so between financial aid and, for example, the bursar. So curious if you can speak to any innovations where we've seen the aid offer actually connected directly to a bill or an invoice, or just efforts to really streamline and make that communication consistent.
Yes, well, you are hitting the nail on the head, as they say, because when we first started this work, we thought, oh, we could just give you feedback on your, one-page aid offer. And we learned very, very quickly how this is truly systems change work. That, changing terms, you're going to need to be connecting with your admissions friends who are talking about this and recruiting students. And clearly the connection between the financial aid office and the bursar is a very important one. And it's unique on each campus, as we learned, that we did do some work with bursars and business offices. And they said how eager they often are to connect back, because students, literally might go to one office and have to walk across campus to the next office and go back to the one office. They're seeking and trying to figure out where to get the information. And so the best practice strategy that we've seen is getting a small team of folks who are systems change oriented and colleagues with a person from a couple different departments that you can bring together and share some ideas and think out loud. And even if it doesn't mean that you start everyone together right away, even if you start having a conversation, make some small changes for what's within your control with the financial aid office, but you're building buy-in with other departments as you do that. And then in the second phase and the third phase, you can grow it out. So at Colorado State, given that example, at first it was just that one aid offer moment. Then we worked with what they call RamWeb, which is their internal portal. And so when we went and visited and talked to staff and students, we did a whole analysis and an audit, if you will, of their RamWeb as well to help them find out about how to be more consistent across the whole scope of the student experience.
Well, that's it for questions that we have received in the chat. Thanks so much to this group for your engagement. Please welcome in these last few. Oh, great. Zach, I'm going to let you ask your question direct.
I know, I got to ask. So I'm a stickler for good color contrast on my documents. And the first thing I noticed about the Colorado State example with the colors is that I would really have to zoom in to be able to pick out the dark colored font on a dark background. And I was just curious about, the paper copy is one thing, but there are certain ADA compliance standards for digital communication that Title IV institutions and nonprofits have to adhere to. Any discussions about ADA compliance and communication?
Yeah, it's come up less often in our work than we'd like. So it's something that we want to do better at from our end. It's something that we're learning about, and also, frankly, with the grade level equivalency as well from some of your awesome work, Zach, and helping us learn from you in the field and continue to combine those issues. I think it's really important. And I can say that a lot of the more recent research, again, from our partners, New America, they just came out with some more recent user-based reviews and research that they've done, which really came back to the black and white as being the preferred colors, if you will, from students. So that's from students and understanding, let alone that really, obviously, black and white really matches ADA very nicely with the contrast.
Yeah. And too, the out of the box, so many practitioners that I've worked with, they start on Microsoft Word, and that's how documents are created. And then they kind of mutate into PDF formats and into student information systems, whether that's Slate or Banner or whatever, PeopleSoft, Oracle, whatever they're using. And so how that document changes in the look and the function, and then as it changes system, the user experience changes, and you can add little bells and whistles and decorative elements. And it's actually really refreshing to hear that, simple is preferred by students, which is great. And we can all kind of take that ethos into almost everything that we do,
Absolutely. And we've been so encouraged just from many of the partners we work with at the financial aid offices, like Iowa came back and said, wow, we had less students drop out this fall. We were having deeper conversations that normally happen in August and September. We were having them in May and June with our students because we didn't have to keep explaining things over and over and over again. So simple can also mean you get to those more complex moments that are what you live for. It's why you do when you wake up every day as financial aid administrators. You want to be counseling students and advising them. And that's something that we've been really buoyed by to see as such a vital piece of impact from doing this work.
Awesome. That is very refreshing to hear. And I know we are coming up right on time. It's almost noon, which it can be a sacred time for like lunches and Zoom breaks and kids and dogs and cats and whatever y'all have going on today. So I first like to thank Laura and Allie for doing this. Thank you, because this is incredibly impactful. Not only the research side, but then the practitioner side. I mean, you're marrying those two things. It's like true praxis, which is awesome. It is awesome. So thank you so much for doing this. And in the chat to all of the attendees today, 2 reports. So the very first report is really what a lot of this research was based on, the Decoding the Cost of College report. That link is there. When I send y'all the video recording of this, I will link that report. You have to read it. I've read it. I think it's awesome. And guess what? It's readable and simple, right? So uAspire is practicing what they preach, y'all. So get on that. The second report I think is really compelling. It's the Beyond the College Bill report about the indirect expenses. And let me tell you, in my college experiences, a lot of times those are rolled into fees or rolled into estimated fees or other costs. And it's so confusing explaining to a student, well, there's, other things other than tuition that y'all have to think about when you go to college, especially for first gen students. It's really, really important to drill some of those points home. And that is kind of a sister report to the Decoding the Cost of College report. So please, I sent a link in the chat to that report as well, Beyond the College Bill. Please read that, please engage, and then reach out to Laura and Allie. Y'all will have their contact information. They're happy to consult with you and understand how you can simplify and consolidate your communication. We learned a little bit about it this week. We're just extending it this week. So Laura and Allie, thank you so much for doing this with us today. We really appreciate it.
Really our pleasure. Thank you so much for having us. And like I said, a lot of gratitude to you. Try to go take a step forward to apply this and let us know how we can help you. We'd love to hear from you.
Awesome. All righty. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. This has been another great financial aid focused webinar. We'll be back next week with a really cool report on the state of student aid in Texas, which we're excited to share as part of the Trellis resource team. But check out the uAspire resources and please connect with Laura and Allie. They will hook you all up with how to, make this stuff simpler, not only for your faculty and staff, but for students primarily, right? Serving students and making it simple for them. So have a great rest of the Wednesday, everyone. Take care, and we will see you soon. Thanks, everybody.